This is Dr. Roger Green in his teaching on American Christianity. This is session number 18, Liberal Theology in America.
I'm on page 15 of the syllabus. Just a reminder kind of about where we are. This is lecture number 14. We're calling this Liberal Theology in America. This is part 4 of the course, Modern America, 1918 to the present. So lecture 14, Liberal Theology in America. What I did was just kind of a reminder. I gave kind of an introduction about what life was like in America between the end of the Civil War, 1865, and the beginning of the First World War, 1918. So the kind of life that was in American broader culture was kind of a progressive life. It was kind of for some people certainly, it was kind of a prosperous life, no doubt. Americans were very confident of the future and very confident of what the future would hold for them. So there is a lot going on. We also mentioned, however, that there were a lot of changes taking place. And we mentioned Darwinism. We'll talk about that again. A lot of historical changes taking place, but especially social changes were taking place with people coming into the cities in great masses, working in the cities. How do you handle all of that, and increasing kind of secularization as well. So now liberalism. What by the way, we'll call this classical Protestant liberalism, just to give an exact label to it. Classical Protestant liberalism starts to take hold in the theology of Christianity in America, in seminaries, pulpits, publications, and so forth. So, okay. So I think that's where we stopped, because I don't think we stopped with number B, 3 strategies for saving Christianity. We didn't start there, did we? We didn't get to that, did we? Okay, 3 strategies for saving Christianity. So let me give a quick introduction, then we're going to look at these 3 this morning. What happens is that with the onslaught of the modern world and with the onslaught of all the things we've kind of talked about, a lot of Christians, well-meaning Christians, thought that Christianity was really in jeopardy. Christianity in America is in jeopardy. It is in jeopardy of kind of caving in. And especially it's in jeopardy of caving in because you've got a pretty tremendous intellectual onslaught against Christianity in this kind of very progressive world in which we're living. You've got people who are doubting the authority of the Bible, people who are doubting the authority of the church. And so intellectually, Christianity is under attack. Now, what happens is there were people in this movement we call classical Protestant liberalism who, what they want to do is they want to save Christianity. They want to save Christianity. They want to make it a viable, healthy, intellectual religion in America. And so what happens is that classical Protestant liberalism devises 3 strategies. These are basically kind of intellectual strategies, but 3 strategies for saving Christianity in America, for 3 strategies for making Christianity alive again in America, in spite of all the onslaught. Okay, so the first one is called deifying the historical process. Deifying the historical process. Okay, so first of all, when we use the word, when we say if something is deified, what do we mean when we use that word? Something is deified, we mean what? You can tell maybe by looking at the word, but I'm sorry? Made into a deity. Something is made into a deity. Something is held to be kind of godlike. So with the first strategy was deifying the historical process. In other words, if we're going to save Christianity in America, let's look at the historical process and let's use that as a way of saving Christianity in America. In other words, if Christians could just understand the historical process, then they would understand what it means to be a good Christian in the modern world. So we call this deifying the historical process. Okay, so what these people preach then, now remember they're preaching this from pulpits, they're teaching this in the seminaries, they're writing about this in books and so forth, what they are teaching is that God reveals himself primarily in history. If you want to know about God, and if you want to have a religion that is kind of God-centered once again, because they felt Christianity was in jeopardy. So what you have to do is to understand that God reveals himself in history. And that's not new, because when you look at the Old Testament, one of the ways in which God shows himself is by the way he has worked with the people of Israel. So that's not a new thing. However, the new thing in a sense was that God reveals himself in history, but he also incarnates himself in humanity. Not through Jesus Christ, but through humanity. God, we look at humanity and we see the incarnation of God in humanity. And it's humanity that kind of carries forth the history in which we see God, in which we understand God. Now, already, you should start to have some kind of question marks there already when I say that. But remember, they're trying to save Christianity, redeem Christianity, and this is the way they do it. So now, these people also believe in Jesus. They have a view of Jesus, no doubt about that. So they don't discount Jesus. They even call him Christ. So now, the important thing about Jesus Christ is, however, is not that he was God. That's not the important thing about Jesus. The important thing about Jesus Christ is that he was so at one with the deity, with God. He was so in touch with God. He was so kind of connected with God that he embodies the kind of close relationship between the divine and the historical. He's the embodiment of that wonderful relationship between God and history, coming in Christ, and he is in Jesus. So therefore, the best thing you can do when it comes to Jesus is to imitate him. We shouldn't think about these people who are kind of teaching this now, deifying the historical process, that we shouldn't think about him as God, but we should think about him as a human being who is very much connected with God, in touch with God, and who very much understood the historical process that God is working out in his world. And so the best thing you can do is try to imitate Jesus. Try to be a kind of a person who is also very much in touch with God and understanding the historical process of God in the world. These people also, we should say, these people also talked about the kingdom. They liked kingdom language. That's okay to use kingdom language, as long as we understand the kingdom to be the continual unveiling of who God is in the historical process. So you don't need to understand the kingdom of God in some kind of a theological way, something that was established by Christ. But if you understand the kingdom of God as an evolution of the historical processes of God in history and so forth, you're going to have a pretty good understanding about what Jesus was trying to teach you about the kingdom of God. So, again, biblical language is used here, but it is used in a bit of a different way by these people trying to save Christianity. So, okay, another thing about deifying the historical process. These people read the Bible. They believe in the Bible. They open up their Bibles. They preach from the Bible. They teach from the Bible. They believe in the Bible. They have not let the Bible go. So, however, as far as they're concerned, the Bible should never be seen as some kind of a theological work. If you're interpreting the Bible theologically, or if you're interpreting the Bible doctrinally, you're on the wrong course in terms of hermeneutics. What you need to read, when you open the Bible, you need to read it as a historical document. You need to read it as kind of the unveiling of God at work in history. Now, for a lot of these people, the great way that God is at work in history is through religious experience. And we'll talk about that later on as well. Religious experience is the way in which you see God most dominantly at work in the historical process. So they placed a great emphasis on religious experience. Now remember, for them, religious experience isn't sin. redemption, sanctification. Religious experience for them is to be somehow connected with God the same way Jesus was connected with God, to have kind of the mind of God in you and so forth. So, but you see that religious experience. So, okay, another thing then, and that is, how should you? You're going to read this. You're going to read this document called the Bible. You're going to read it as a historical document, unfolding history. And is there anything that you should get out of it in terms of your life that you're living? And the answer to that is yes. There are principles. There are basic principles in the biblical message that you should get out of the Bible. So those principles have been true all throughout history, and you should exercise those principles in personal morality and in social ethics. So one principle, obviously, would be the principle of love. God is a loving God. We see this in the historical narrative as the historical narrative unfolds, and we should be loving to one another. So the principle of love, for example, is an eternal principle in the Bible from Genesis to the book of the Revelation. So get those principles and apply those principles to your personal life and apply them to social ethics, and you're going to be okay. You're going to understand what the Bible's trying to teach you. So, okay. Now, progress. These people also deifying the historical process. These people believed in the progress of humanity. As they looked at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, they felt that humanity is progressing, is getting better and better and better. And they were looking forward to the 20th century to be a Christian century. So they saw progress. They saw the 20th century is going to be this great Christian century. And therefore deifying the historical process is the way to go. Okay, funny thing, however, the 20th century began in 1914 with World War I. So if you think that the 20th century is going to be a great Christian century, it's going to be kind of the great unfolding of God's history, you're going to be in trouble with that theology. You're not going to be able to sustain that theology after World War I because World War I was so brutal and so forth. We've already talked about that. So this becomes problematic for people who want to deify the historical process. What happens when the historical process not only gets sidetracked, what happens when the historical process gets really, really, really messed up with World War I and World War II and Korea and Vietnam and the Holocaust, and what happens then to your kind of deifying the historical process? So there are some problems there. But there were a number of theologians, a number of pastors who deified the historical process, and that's the way to go. That's, if we can just instill that in people kind of doctrinally, if we can get them reading the Bible that way, if we can get the preachers preaching that message, we're going to save Christianity in America. We're going to make it something viable again, because they saw it as something that had pretty much caved in. So that's the first kind of tactic or the first kind of strategy here. Okay, questions about that one, deifying the historical process?
I just find myself kind of wondering if there is any more focus when you say these people, talking about in general, people who were worried about liberal Christians in America. Are there like particular things you would do?
Yeah, there are, and we're going to be getting to some names here. I'll do the three first, and then we're going to be getting to some names of people who, in one way or another, forwarded these strategies. So we will see some folks. Yeah. Right. That's a good question. This is more of a Protestant. Project, because Roman Catholicism still after the Civil War is still getting its act together. It's still an immigrant church. It's still It's still kind of consolidating itself, and then we get into World War I and so forth. This is really a Protestant project that we're talking about here, right? Yeah. Yes, and where we would use them in a place like Gordon, for example, will be in reaction to this. With the and we'll talk a lot about that because we talk about fundamentalism and evangelicalism. So, but with the founding of the Bible colleges and places like that, that is a reaction to a liberalism which perceived not to save American Christianity, but to further remove it from its roots. So we'll see a lot of that. Yeah. Yeah. Right.
Reveals himself through history, but like their new theology kind of they bring in, like these people in deified historical process, like they say that God incarnates himself in humanity.
Right. Right. In other words, they don't believe in the incarnation in one person. God didn't come in the flesh in one person, but God comes to this world in a real tangible way. So I don't mean incarnation like I would mean it if we talk about the incarnation of Jesus, the God coming in the flesh. But tangible would be a good thing. What's the tangible way in which God manifests himself? And the tangible way is through history. You can see how God has worked, Old Testament, New Testament, history of the church, history in America. I mean, you can see that, trace that. And so that's a tangible way you can understand God, through that kind of incarnation. So, but he's not coming in the flesh and the person of every human being, but he's coming in a tangible way through history that we human beings should be able to see if we're reading the Bible correctly and if we're preaching correctly and so forth. Yeah. Something else? Yeah, Emery? Right.
Would come from like a reaction from this, especially in like
Yes. What will happen is when we see evangelicalism, fundamentalism, evangelicalism, when we see them coming along, part of it is a reaction to these three that we'll talk about. And now we've got a couple of other lectures before we get to fundamentalism, evangelicalism. So because we do want to talk about Neo Orthodoxy, we do want to talk about Rauschenbusch, and so we're fleshing this out a bit. But then we'll see how fundamentalism, evangelicalism responds to this. But that's right. Largely, it will be responding to these kinds of ideas that we're mentioning with these three movements. Yeah. Something else about deifying the historical process. Okay, so it's a strategy for what? It's a strategy for saving Christianity in America, making it strong again. So, and as Carter mentioned, it's a Protestant strategy, basically. Roman Catholicism was not involved in this at this time. So, okay, that's number one. Number two is stressing the ethical. Stressing the ethical. Okay, so for these people, and here's another thing. With the three that we're going to be talking about, I don't want you to get the idea that there were there was kind of one group of people here, and then there's another group of people here, and then there's another group. These things all kind of intersect with each other. This is kind of a classical liberal Protestant strategy for saving. But I'm just explaining them in these three ways, so I hope it'll make sense to you. So that's the only reason I'm doing it. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. The key, for stressing the ethical, the key test for Christianity, and this became almost a byword for people: life, not doctrine. Life, not doctrine. Christianity is about life. It's not about doctrine. It's about the life you live and the kind of life you live. And so, therefore, these people felt we can save Christianity and really make it viable if we really stress this. So it's not doctrine we're concerned with. It is life, living a good, ethical, kind of moral life. So, okay, who becomes the example here? Of course, once again, Jesus becomes the example. Jesus was the person who lived the life in relationship with God. The true life as it should be lived. Look at Jesus, and then you'll have your example. Okay, and so for these people, notice, Jesus did not emphasize judgment. Jesus emphasized love. So living a loving life is really what life should be all about if you're a Christian. And judgment should be out of the picture. You know, they were nervous about judgment. Yeah, Haley? Right. They did not believe Jesus was God. But that would be true for all three that we'll talk about in general. That they did believe that Jesus was sent from God. They have a high view of Jesus, and that he had a special relationship with God, but he wasn't God in the flesh. Yeah. So Jesus becomes your example. Jesus becomes your moral example, your ethical example. So now, one thing that was important, that is very important for people stressing the ethical, and that is Christian education. Christian education becomes really, really critical. The Sunday school movement, in a sense, was taken over somewhat by some of these people because they want to stress the ethical. And how can you, if you're going to stress the ethical, you've got to educate people. You've got to train people in terms of what the ethical is all about. Okay. Illustration here from my own personal life, which I will not tell you the name of the church. I will not tell you where the church is located. I will not tell you what denomination it is. But many, many years ago, I was asked to go and do a Sunday school class on the Gospel of John for an adult in this church, for an adult Sunday school group. And I think I was there for 4 weeks, 4 Sundays. Now, I found it a little strange. And I'll let you decide. I found it a little strange. We went, the first Sunday, and so I obviously had my Bible because we are doing the Gospel of John, actually, so I found it strange that nobody had Bibles. Nobody thought to bring a Bible. Why would you bring a Bible to church? I mean, we're kind of making this connection. I'm not sure why they asked, but anyways, not quite making this connection. And so they scurried around, and they did find a couple of Bibles in the church somewhere, hidden away in the cupboard or something. So they found a couple of Bibles, and they were able to, kind of look. People were able to look with each other. Now, then, finding the Gospel of John was a pretty major chore. So I had to, okay, let's see what Bible you're using. Okay, let's turn to page 1009. And so, so the first Sunday was really hard, but now after a while, I think we maybe got the gist of it. But I'm not sure why I was invited. I'm not sure whose idea it was in that church to actually have a Bible study. I mean, why would you do that in a church? And then I had a little bit of a disconcerting, little adventure here. On my 4th Sunday, when I was finished, I just walked down the hallway, and there were Sunday school classes for kids, different ages and everything. And I noticed in 2 or 3 of the rooms that they were still going on. Their class was still going on. I noticed in 2 or 3 of the rooms that they were showing cartoons, like Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck and Davy Crockett and all that, showing cartoons. And I was watching these cartoons for quite a while and everything. So I just happened to ask someone in the church, tell me about the Sunday school class. Well, we don't use the Bible with our kids in Sunday school. That would be out, forbidden. But we do show them cartoons, and we think that from these cartoons they can get some moral values in terms of how they should live their Christian life. And so they think that the cartoons give them a better moral understanding of the Christian life than the Bible and so forth. So why would you use the Bible in Sunday school? I mean, who would think of it? So cartoon, I said cartoon, they never invited me back. I've never been back, but it was it was very strange kind of event in my own life, because that's just not the world I live in. And but it was very liberal church, and basically, why use the Bible when you can use cartoons? I should tell you about one church. I got to watch my time, but I should tell you about one church I went to. This is a very interesting church. I shouldn't do this, but I will. But I used to take students to New York City. At Barrington College, we used to have a winter in January, so we'd have 3 weeks. In my winter, I used to take students to New York City for those 3 weeks. And I wanted them to see what is called an experimental church in Greenwich Village. So on one Sunday, we went to that church, and it was called the Judson Memorial Church. And after Adoniram Judson, by the way, Judson Memorial Church. Very interesting church. And I didn't know how my students were going to react to this, so we had interesting discussions after. But, for example, on one Sunday that we went one year, the pastor preaches from the piano because he's a jazz pianist, so he preaches from the piano. And all of the hymns that morning were on Mickey Mouse, like Disney songs, like Mickey Mouse and Davy Crockett, and those were the hymns for the morning of the church, because he was preaching from his piano on a Mickey Mouse religion. So in order to get us in sync with the Mickey Mouse religion that he was preaching from, we sang Mickey Mouse, Disney songs. So they were the hymns of the church. So they said, that's were the hymns for the morning. So it was a very interesting experimental church. And it's Judson Memorial Church. When you think of the background, Adoniram Judson, it's a Judson Memorial Church, but very experimental. So another time we were there for another year, but it was communion in the church. It's communion time in the church, so I thought this is going to be interesting. Wonder what they were going to do. They're more kind of liberally oriented, you might say. And so for communion, it was Coca-Cola and potato chips for communion. So they passed around some potato chips and then some Coca-Cola and so forth. So very interesting, Judson Memorial Church. So you can get, this has nothing to do with anything, so I'm going to lecture again. But it just reminded me going to that other church, and then I've been to Judson Memorial Church. And so you can get some interesting, strange, and wonderful phenomenons out there. But in any case, back to stressing the ethical. Okay, so that's what these people do, stressing the ethical. Okay, now, there were some of these folks, now we're going to get into a couple of names. There were some folks who stressed really personal ethics and sometimes almost a health and wealth gospel, but they were more connected theologically. So they were people who theologically were more rooted, but some textbooks still refer to them as kind of in the liberal tradition. But I want you to know they're more theologically rooted than the kind of the excesses we've been talking about. Let me mention 4 of them. The first 2 tended to, at times, stress the individualism of the gospel, and at times they tended to stress almost a health and wealth gospel at times. They weren't Joel Osteen, but they tended to stress a health and wealth gospel at times. And the 2 of them that are the most famous were Henry Ward Beecher, and those are his dates, and then Phillips Brooks at Trinity Church. And in our second field trip, we go to Trinity Church, and we see the Church of Phillips Brooks. Now, we want to reiterate, these people might have been more in the liberal tradition, but they were grounded much more than what we've been talking about. They were grounded in the Scriptures and in God as Christ and in the Trinity and so forth. But they were people a little more in the liberal tradition. And sometimes in their preaching, they would stress the ethical, but they did believe that Jesus was God. They did believe in the Trinity and so forth. But those are 2 names you want to take note of. 2 other names that you want to take note of were Washington Gladden and Walter Rauschenbusch. I'll be right with you, Carter. Washington Gladden and Walter Rauschenbusch. Now, you've read that biography of Rauschenbusch. You've probably read it 2 or 3 times over by now because you've had since the first day to read it. So if you're reading a chapter a week, you've read it probably 3 times. But and so these 2 were the founders of what becomes known as the social gospel. Now, but these 2 people also are well-grounded theologically, well-grounded in terms of the Trinity and the Incarnation and so forth. And as a matter of fact, as we'll stress when we lecture on Rauschenbusch, and your book stresses, Rauschenbusch even would be considered an evangelical. That's a label that the author of your book notices uses for Rauschenbusch. So, however, I'm using Gladden and Rauschenbusch as people who have a liberal tendency to stress the social part of the gospel. So that's where this kind of stressing the ethical goes. It can go into an individual stress of the ethical, like it did with Beecher and Brooks at times, or it can go into a social stress of the ethical, like it did with Gladden and Rauschenbusch at times. So this stressing the ethical can go in either of those, in a sense, in either of those two directions. Okay, I saw Carter's hand here. So stressing the ethical. Yes. Right. He was you're talking about Henry Ward Beecher? He was right. His dad was Lyman Beecher. But he is, the individualism that he sometimes stressed, he might have come under criticism for. But these four people are certainly within the pale of Orthodox Christianity, though. No doubt about that. Okay, so that. Number 3. Let me go back here. Number 3. Okay. Third, and the centrality of religious feeling. The centrality of religious feeling. A third way in which to kind of redeem Christianity in America. Okay, so jot that down, and that's also in your syllabus. Centrality of religious feeling. Oops. All right. Now, we will never understand the centrality of the religious feeling unless we understand Friedrich Schleiermacher. So I need to begin with a little bit of church history, a little bit of theological history, and that is with Friedrich Schleiermacher, and this is the picture of Friedrich Schleiermacher here. Okay, Friedrich Schleiermacher. A lot of you have, before this course began, you heard of Jonathan Edwards, you heard of John Calvin. How many of you have heard of Friedrich Schleiermacher before today? Is anybody? 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 4 people, 5 people. Okay, Friedrich Schleiermacher. Let's give a title to him, just to place him somewhere. Sometimes he's called the father of liberal theology, Friedrich Schleiermacher. Okay, and Friedrich Schleiermacher was a German theologian, and he was a German theologian who was facing the same crisis in Germany that the people are facing in America who are developing these strategies. But he's, a little bit earlier here. Those are the dates of Schleiermacher. Okay, so what crisis is Schleiermacher facing? He's facing the crisis that Christianity and the Bible is outmoded. Nobody needs it anymore, thank you very much. Maybe we used to need it, but we don't need it now. That's the crisis he was facing in Germany at the time. So therefore, Schleiermacher feels that God called him to minister to what he called the cultural despisers of religion. So he ministers to the cultural despisers of religion. In other words, he ministers to the up and out. He ministers to the wealthy, to the influential, to the powerful in German society, in order to help them understand that Christianity is relevant for their life. In other words, he's trying to save Christianity in Germany, just like the people we're talking about are trying to redeem it in America. But he comes a little earlier. So that's why he's called the father of Christian liberalism. Okay, so now, whenever I talk about Schleiermacher, I always have a long sermon, so I'm going to make my long sermon short because I don't have time. Some of you are going to minister to the poor, and that's a wonderful, in whatever ministry God gives you, whatever vocation he leads you into, you will be dealing with the poor and the marginalized and the helpless and the homeless and so forth. I mean, some of you undoubtedly will have that kind of ministry. That's a wonderful thing. Some of you, however, may be called by God to minister to the wealthy, to the influential, to the powerful in society, like Schleiermacher was. He felt that this was his call. That's a legitimate call. Minister to the cultural despisers of religion. That's a legitimate call. And some of you, God may place some of you in a place, such a place in life by your vocation that that's what you're going to be doing. But that is a call, and you need to follow that call. So I've got lots of illustrations I can use in this, but we don't have time for that. But anyways, Friedrich Schleiermacher ministered to what he called the culture of despisers of religion. Okay, now, what did he do that other people are starting to do with this third way? What he did was he emphasized religious feeling, religious emotion, religious attachment to God. That's what he emphasized, to bring these cultural despisers back into Christianity. So, Schleiermacher, therefore, and the people who emphasize the centrality of religious feeling, Schleiermacher and people who did so in America downplayed dogma and doctrine and theology. They really downplayed that. And they didn't want any kind of literal interpretation of the Bible on anything. They wanted to understand the Bible only as a book that helps us to understand our relationship with God. So dogma is out. Doctrine is out. Theology is out. Literal interpretation of the Bible is out. Religious feeling is in. And so this becomes, for Schleiermacher and then for people in America, when you bring it over to America, this becomes kind of a religion of the heart. Now, therefore, what happens in the broader culture, and I'll close with this, we need to close a little early to get our exams back and everything, but therefore, what happens in the broader culture as far as Schleiermacher is concerned and people in America are concerned? What happens is we can allow science to do its thing. We can allow education to do its thing. We can allow art to do its thing. We can allow mathematics to do its thing. Because that's another realm in which God is working. But the religious realm in which God works is in the heart of the individual and in the individual's religious experience. So, as far as these people are concerned, there's no contest between religion and science. There's no contest between religion and art, or no contest between religion and education. We can allow those things to flourish, and we shouldn't feel that we need to be contesting with them at all in the broader culture. So this becomes a religion of the heart, and becomes a way of saving Christianity, convincing people that God wants you to have a religious feeling and in association with him. And now for Schleiermacher then, who becomes a great model of this then for Schleiermacher? The great model of the person who's religiously in touch with God all the time, constantly, continually. The great model becomes Jesus, of course. Jesus becomes the great model of the person who is absolutely dependent upon God in his own life. So 3 strategies. We might have some questions about these before we get into the battle lines when we meet on Friday. So I'm going to stop here.
This is Dr. Roger Green in his teaching on American Christianity. This is session number 18, Liberal Theology in America.